April 2016, Baguio City. Hotel staff discovered 3 bodies in a locked room: a husband, his wife, and another couple. No forced entry, no witnesses. Just a single piece of evidence that would unravel a story about marriage, boredom, and a decision that shattered multiple lives. This case involves an increasingly common phenomenon: couples seeking thrills outside traditional boundaries, and the devastating consequences when fantasy collides with reality. I'm examining what happens when trust is redefined, and what occurs when that experiment goes catastrophically wrong. Dino and Maricar Soriano appeared to embody stability. Married nearly 10 years, they had a young son named Gio and lived in a modest apartment in Baguio City. Dino worked as a courier for a local logistics company. Steady employment, reliable income. Maricar held a night shift position at a call center, contributing to their household finances. To neighbors and family, they represented an ordinary, middle-class Filipino family navigating life's routines together. But beneath this conventional exterior, something was shifting. By December 2015, Maricar found herself experiencing what psychologists call relational ennui, a profound sense of monotony in her daily existence. Her life had become predictable: work night shifts, care for their child during the day, manage household responsibilities, repeat endlessly. The passion she'd once felt in her marriage had diminished into comfortable routine. Dino, perpetually exhausted from his demanding courier work, offered little emotional engagement. Their conversations became transactional rather than intimate. The warmth that had characterized their early relationship had cooled into polite coexistence. One evening, while browsing online, Maricar discovered something that would fundamentally alter their lives: a private community for couples exploring alternative relationship structures. The group discussed what's commonly known as wife swapping or partner swapping, arrangements where committed couples consensually engage with other couples for shared, intimate experiences. Initially, Maricar approached this discovery with curiosity rather than intent. She read testimonials from participants who claimed such experiences revitalized stagnant marriages, provided adventure, and strengthened bonds through shared novelty. The concept seemed simultaneously transgressive and intriguing, a potential solution to the boredom consuming her. She shared her discovery with Dino, expecting either enthusiastic agreement or outright rejection. His actual response fell somewhere more complex. Initially, he reacted with anger and confusion, questioning why their marriage wasn't sufficient for her. But as Maricar withdrew emotionally over subsequent weeks, Dino faced a difficult calculation: refuse and potentially lose his wife to resentment and growing distance, or agree and attempt to salvage their connection through unconventional means. Fear of abandonment ultimately shaped his decision. Dino convinced himself that participating might inject excitement into their relationship, that this could be the spice or adventure Maricar insisted they needed. He rationalized that controlled experimentation might prove safer than her seeking fulfillment independently, potentially through an affair. Through the private messaging platform, they connected with Ramon and Ella Abasolo, a couple from La Union in their early 30s. The Abasolos presented themselves as experienced in this lifestyle, open-minded, professionally employed, and interested in meeting new partners. The photographs they shared suggested an attractive, put-together couple, people who appeared respectable despite their unconventional recreational choices. After weeks of digital communication, they agreed to meet in person. February 2016. The agreed-upon meeting location was a hotel in Baguio, neutral territory, far enough from their respective hometowns to provide anonymity, yet accessible for all parties involved. Dino and Maricar prepared for the encounter with markedly different emotional states. Maricar dressed deliberately. Leather jacket, short skirt, makeup applied with particular care. She projected excitement, anticipation, and confidence about what lay ahead. Dino, by contrast, radiated anxiety. During their jeepney ride to the hotel, he repeatedly glanced at his wife, searching for signals he could no longer interpret. Was she genuinely excited? Nervous? Having second thoughts? He couldn't determine her internal state, and more disturbingly, he couldn't identify his own feelings, a mixture of dread, curiosity, and resignation that defied clear categorization. As they entered the hotel lobby, Dino experienced what many describe as a moment of clarity, an intense urge to abort the entire plan. His breathing became shallow. An internal voice insisted this was wrong, that they should leave immediately. But when he saw Maricar eagerly greeting Ella, laughing naturally, walking purposefully toward the stairs, he found himself paralyzed. He wanted to grab her hand and pull her back, but his body wouldn't respond to his intentions. Inside the rented room, the air conditioning provided physical coldness that contrasted sharply with the psychological heat of the situation. 4 people sat on opposite edges of the bed, exchanging careful glances, attempting to read each other's boundaries and intentions through subtle signals. The atmosphere was saturated with tension, not the threatening kind, but the uncertain tension of people approaching a threshold they'd never crossed. Ramon and Ella appeared more comfortable, suggesting this wasn't their first such encounter. They initiated conversation, poured wine, and gradually created an atmosphere of relaxation designed to ease the Sorianos' obvious nervousness. Maricar responded well to this social lubrication, laughing at Ramon's jokes, engaging in conversation as though they were old friends, rather than strangers meeting for an unconventional purpose. Dino remained largely silent, observing Ella while simultaneously watching his wife interact with increasing comfort with another man. That observation would become central to what followed, the experience of witnessing his spouse displaying intimacy, laughter, and attraction toward someone else, while he sat mere feet away. As the evening progressed, the initial tension dissolved. What had seemed impossible to imagine became reality. The dynamics that unfolded over subsequent hours left different impressions on each participant. For Maricar, this represented adventure, novelty, and validation, confirmation that life beyond routine was accessible and exhilarating. For Dino, the experience proved psychologically devastating in ways he hadn't anticipated. He watched his wife with Ramon and felt something fracture internally. Not just jealousy, though that emotion was certainly present, but a deeper rupture in his sense of self and relationship security. The agreement he'd made intellectually, the consent he'd provided, couldn't protect him from the visceral reality of witnessing his wife's intimacy with another man. The mental framework he'd constructed to rationalize this situation collapsed under the weight of actual experience. The following morning brought uncomfortable silence. As they packed their belongings, Dino and Maricar avoided meaningful eye contact. The drive home was heavy with unspoken reactions, unprocessed emotions, and fundamentally different interpretations of what had occurred. In the days that followed, their household dynamics shifted dramatically. Dino attempted to convince himself that once was enough, that they'd satisfied curiosity and could now return to normal marital life. But he was internally collapsing, replaying scenes from that hotel room during every quiet moment, feeling diminished in ways he couldn't articulate to his wife. He eventually tried to address it directly, suggesting they shouldn't repeat the experience, emphasizing their son and family stability. Maricar's response was ambiguous, a non-committal nod that provided no clear agreement, delivered with body language suggesting she felt pressured rather than genuinely aligned with his perspective. Over subsequent weeks, Maricar's behavior changed noticeably. She began arriving home later than expected, offering explanations about overtime, team dinners, or meeting friends. While Dino possessed no concrete evidence of ongoing infidelity, his instincts screamed that something was continuing beyond their supposed one-time experiment. From external appearances, Dino maintained functionality. He reported to work, completed his courier deliveries, shared meals with his son, and participated in compound social gatherings when necessary. But internally, he was unraveling. Each late arrival by Maricar added another crack to his psychological stability. Each vague explanation about her whereabouts deepened his suspicion that the one-time experience had evolved into something ongoing. The trust that forms the foundation of functional marriages was eroding rapidly. Dino found himself in a psychological paradox. He had technically consented to the initial encounter, which complicated his ability to frame subsequent events as betrayal. Yet emotionally, he experienced profound violation. The consent he'd provided under pressure now felt like a trap that prevented him from claiming legitimate grievance. April 2016, a Friday afternoon after completing his delivery route, Dino happened to be near Maricar's call center workplace as her shift ended. He watched her exit the building, and instead of heading toward their home, she hailed a taxi. Something in that moment crystallized his suspicions into action. Without overthinking the decision, he followed her on his motorcycle, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while keeping the taxi in sight. His heart pounded as he navigated traffic, part of him hoping his suspicions were wrong, another part grimly certain of what he would discover. The taxi stopped at a hotel on the outskirts of Baguio, not the same establishment as their February encounter, but similar in its anonymity and distance from areas where they might encounter acquaintances. Dino parked across the street and waited, hands trembling slightly as adrenaline flooded his system. Within 5 minutes, he recognized the couple approaching the hotel entrance, Ramon and Ella Abasolo. They greeted Maricar warmly, familiarly, and the three entered together. What struck Dino most painfully was his wife's laughter, genuine, uninhibited joy that he couldn't remember seeing directed at him in months, perhaps years. At this juncture, Dino faced multiple options. He could have confronted them immediately, creating a public scene. He could have left and consulted an attorney about divorce proceedings. He could have returned home and pretended ignorance while processing his emotions. Instead, he made a decision that would alter multiple lives permanently. Dino rented his own room in the same hotel. He sat on the bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. In his left hand, he held an old photograph from their son's baptism, a memory of happier times when their family felt intact and their future seemed secure. In his right hand, he gripped a blade he routinely carried for personal protection during deliveries to remote areas. The psychological state Dino inhabited during those hours is critical to understanding subsequent events. He wasn't simply angry. He was experiencing what psychologists recognize as acute betrayal trauma, complicated by his own conflicted role in establishing the circumstances. He had agreed to the initial encounter, which created cognitive dissonance about whether he had rights to feel betrayed by its continuation. This internal conflict, permission given versus boundaries violated, consent provided versus dignity destroyed, created a psychological pressure that intensified with each passing hour. He replayed conversations, re-examined decisions, and spiraled into increasingly dark ideation about solutions to his unbearable emotional state. Hours passed. The hotel settled into nighttime quiet. Dino emerged from his room and stood before the door where he knew his wife was with the Abasolos. His heart hammered, but his hands were steady, a physiological indicator of someone moving from emotional chaos into determined action. He knocked. Less than a minute passed before the door opened, revealing Ramon wearing only a towel, his expression shifting instantly from casual expectation to startled recognition. What occurred in the following minutes happened quickly and would leave 3 people deceased. The following morning, April 27, 2016, housekeeping staff arrived for routine room cleaning around 9 a.m. After multiple unanswered knocks, management was contacted and the decision made to open the room using a master key. What they discovered would traumatize the hotel employees and launch a major criminal investigation. 3 bodies were found inside: Maricar Soriano, Ramon Abasolo, and Ella Abasolo. The room showed no signs of forced entry from the exterior. The scene, while disturbing, was confined to specific areas, with the rest of the room appearing undisturbed. A blade was recovered from the bathroom area. The lack of external forced entry immediately suggested the perpetrator either had a key or had been admitted voluntarily by someone inside. Hotel management immediately contacted local authorities. Within hours, investigators were reviewing security footage, interviewing staff, and attempting to reconstruct the timeline. The room had been registered under Maricar Soriano's name, which quickly led police to investigate her background, marital status, and potential motives for anyone to harm her. The CCTV footage provided crucial evidence. Cameras captured a male figure entering the hallway late the previous evening, approaching the victim's room, and being admitted inside. Hours later, the same individual was recorded leaving, head down, moving deliberately toward the stairwell without looking back. He never returned. Investigators identified the man as Dino Soriano, Maricar's husband. This identification was straightforward, given that he'd rented his own room in the same hotel using his identification documents. The digital trail was clear and damning. Police immediately proceeded to the Soriano residence in Aurora Hill. Dino was not there. His mother-in-law, Maricar's mother, was caring for young Gio and was devastated by the news. According to her statement, Dino had been quiet in recent days, but she'd attributed this to normal marital stress, never imagining it would escalate to violence. The families of all 3 victims were notified. Maricar's relatives expressed profound grief, complicated by shock that their son-in-law could be responsible. Ramon and Ella's families were equally traumatized, struggling to understand how a social encounter had resulted in their loved ones' deaths. For 3 weeks, Dino remained at large. He didn't report to work, didn't contact friends, and effectively disappeared from his normal routines. Investigators issued warrants and alerts, but his whereabouts remained unknown. Then, in May 2016, Dino voluntarily surrendered himself to authorities. The reasons for his surrender weren't fully articulated, but likely involved a combination of factors: inability to sustain life as a fugitive, guilt over abandoning his son, and recognition that capture was inevitable. He retained legal counsel and, contrary to many defendants who claim innocence despite overwhelming evidence, Dino provided a full confession. He explained the entire context: the wife-swapping arrangement, the initial encounter in February, his subsequent psychological deterioration, his discovery of the ongoing affair, and his actions at the hotel. His attorney's strategy didn't involve disputing the facts. The evidence was irrefutable, but rather contextualizing Dino's mental state. The defense presented arguments about psychological distress, provocation, and what Philippine criminal law recognizes as crimes of passion, offenses committed in moments of intense emotional disturbance triggered by the victim's actions. This legal framework distinguishes between premeditated acts and those committed under extreme emotional circumstances. While it doesn't excuse the conduct, it can significantly affect sentencing by recognizing the human psychological reality that people under severe emotional strain sometimes act in ways they wouldn't under normal circumstances. The prosecution, representing the victims' families, argued for maximum penalties, emphasizing that regardless of marital issues, Dino had committed a serious criminal offense, resulting in 3 deaths. They highlighted that he'd had opportunities to make different choices, to leave, to pursue legal separation, to seek counseling. After months of proceedings, the judge delivered a verdict: guilty. However, the court acknowledged the mitigating circumstances of psychological distress and provocation. Instead of a life sentence, Dino received 10 years of imprisonment. Dino entered the Philippine correctional system in 2016, carrying not just a legal sentence, but the profound weight of having destroyed multiple lives, including his own family's future. While incarcerated, he maintained one singular focus: ensuring his son Gio would be cared for, and eventually understanding that, despite everything, his father still loved him. Prison provided Dino with forced reflection. Away from the circumstances that had driven his actions, he could process what had occurred with some psychological distance. According to those familiar with his incarceration, he participated in available rehabilitative programs, maintained disciplinary compliance, and demonstrated genuine remorse for his actions. In 2022, after serving approximately 6 years, Dino was released under good conduct time allowance, a provision in Philippine law that reduces sentences for prisoners who demonstrate exemplary behavior and participate in rehabilitation efforts. His early release wasn't automatic. It required consistent demonstration that he genuinely changed and no longer posed a threat to society. Upon release, Dino faced the complex challenge of reuniting with his son. Gio had been in his maternal grandmother's care throughout Dino's imprisonment, the same woman who had lost her daughter due to Dino's actions. Initially, she refused to allow Gio contact with his father, viewing Dino as having forfeited parental rights through his crimes. However, circumstances evolved. Maricar's mother's health deteriorated, and her financial resources proved insufficient to adequately care for a growing child. After lengthy negotiations involving social services and family counseling, she reluctantly agreed that Gio should reunite with his father. That reunion was emotionally complicated. Gio, now a teenager, harbored understandable confusion, anger, and grief. He'd lost his mother, his father had been imprisoned for causing that loss, and he'd spent formative years being raised by his grandmother. The psychological damage from this childhood trauma would require ongoing processing. Yet, blood relationships and the human need for family connection proved powerful. Gradually, carefully, Dino and Gio began rebuilding their relationship. It wasn't the father-son dynamic that had existed before April 2016. That innocence was permanently lost. Instead, it was something new, built on honesty about what had occurred and Dino's commitment to being present moving forward. Dino found employment as a mechanic at a small Baguio repair shop, work far removed from his previous logistics career, but sufficient to provide for their modest needs. They rented a small house, shared meals together, and slowly constructed a new normal from the wreckage of their past. Their life now is defined by simplicity: work, school, home routines, and the occasional shared laughter that signals healing remains possible even after profound tragedy. Dino will never escape his past. The scars are permanent, both psychological and social, but he's been granted something many in his situation never receive: a second chance at fatherhood, and the opportunity to demonstrate that people can change. For Gio, the path forward involves complicated grief, mourning his mother while maintaining relationship with the father responsible for her death, processing anger while accepting love, and somehow integrating this traumatic history into a functional adult identity. This case demands we examine the psychological mechanisms underlying what occurred, not to excuse Dino's actions, but to understand the human factors that transform relationship dysfunction into tragedy. Let's begin with the concept of consensual non-monogamy, which encompasses various arrangements including the wife swapping or partner swapping that initiated this chain of events. Research on these relationship structures reveals they can function successfully, but only under specific conditions. Genuine mutual desire from both partners, clear communication about boundaries, psychological security within the primary relationship, and the ability to separate physical encounters from emotional attachment. The Sorianos violated virtually every principle of healthy consensual non-monogamy. Maricar initiated the idea from boredom and dissatisfaction, using novelty to address problems that required different solutions. Dino agreed, not from authentic interest, but from fear of losing his wife. This foundational imbalance meant the arrangement was compromised from inception. Psychologists recognize what's called coerced consent, agreements made under emotional pressure rather than genuine willingness. While Dino technically consented to the February encounter, the circumstances of that consent matter enormously. He agreed because Maricar withdrew affection when he initially refused, creating an implicit ultimatum: participate or risk the relationship. This isn't freely given consent, it's compliance under duress. The psychological impact of the hotel encounter on Dino illustrates a phenomenon called retroactive jealousy, or retrospective jealousy, intense emotional distress about a partner's past or present intimate experiences with others. Even in arrangements where intellectual consent exists, witnessing or knowing about a spouse's intimacy with another person can trigger profound psychological reactions. Feelings of inadequacy, territorial instincts, and threats to one's sense of masculine or feminine identity. For Dino specifically, watching Maricar with Ramon likely activated deep-seated insecurities about his worth as a partner and provider. The laughter he observed, her genuine enjoyment with another man, suggested she was accessing happiness he could no longer provide. This realization was psychologically devastating in ways abstract consent couldn't prepare him for. The subsequent weeks of suspicion and Maricar's evasive behavior compounded his distress. He existed in a state of hypervigilance, constantly monitoring for signs of continued betrayal, while simultaneously questioning whether he had rights to feel betrayed, given his initial agreement. This cognitive dissonance, permission granted versus boundaries violated, creates severe psychological strain. When Dino followed Maricar to the hotel in April and confirmed ongoing encounters with the Abasolos, his psychological framework collapsed entirely. The one-time experiment he'd rationalized had become an ongoing affair. The woman he'd married was prioritizing these encounters over their family. His consent had been exploited rather than respected. What occurred in that hotel room represents what criminal psychology terms a crime of passion, an offense committed during intense emotional disturbance rather than calm premeditation. This doesn't excuse the actions legally or morally, but it distinguishes them from calculated violence. Dino wasn't functioning rationally. He was operating from a place of acute psychological crisis. Several risk factors converged: betrayal trauma, damaged masculine identity, social shame, knowing others were aware of his situation, financial stress, sleep deprivation, and the weapon he routinely carried that made lethal action easily accessible. Each factor individually might have been manageable. Combined, they created catastrophic vulnerability. It's crucial to note that millions of people experience similar stressors without resorting to violence. Dino's actions remain his responsibility. However, understanding contributing factors helps identify intervention points where different choices might have altered outcomes. Couples therapy when marital dissatisfaction first emerged. Individual counseling for Dino when he felt coerced. legal consultation rather than confrontation when he discovered ongoing betrayal. The concept of provocation in criminal law recognizes that human psychology has limits, that certain circumstances can temporarily overwhelm rational decision-making. Philippine courts acknowledged this reality by reducing Dino's sentence from life imprisonment to 10 years, recognizing that while he committed serious crimes, his mental state at the time reflected extreme disturbance rather than inherent dangerousness. The Soriano case illuminates several broader societal issues that extend far beyond this individual tragedy. Let's examine these systemic factors and what they reveal about contemporary relationship challenges. First, consider the role of digital technology in facilitating alternative relationship arrangements. The private online group where Maricar discovered wife-swapping wouldn't have existed 20 years ago. The internet has democratized access to communities organized around virtually any interest, including sexual and relationship experimentation. This accessibility has positive dimensions. People can find others with similar interests, reducing isolation. But it also enables rapid entry into complex arrangements without adequate preparation or understanding of psychological risks. Research on online communities centered on alternative lifestyles reveals they often present idealized narratives, emphasizing successful experiences while minimizing or omitting accounts of relationships damaged by such experiments. Maricar likely encountered predominantly positive testimonials from people who'd benefited from these arrangements, creating selection bias that didn't reflect the full range of possible outcomes. This phenomenon parallels social media's tendency to showcase highlight reels rather than comprehensive reality. People share success stories, not cautionary tales. Someone exploring these communities might conclude that problems are rare when, in fact, unsuccessful experiments simply aren't publicized as frequently. The economic dimension of this case also warrants examination. Dino and Maricar represented the Filipino middle class, employed but not affluent, stable but without significant financial cushion. Economic stress can exacerbate relationship tensions, and the pursuit of novelty sometimes reflects attempts to address feelings of deprivation or limited life options. For couples with constrained resources, exotic vacations, expensive hobbies, or other conventional means of relationship revitalization may feel financially inaccessible, making alternative experiments seem like affordable ways to introduce excitement. The gender dynamics in this case reveal interesting cultural patterns. Maricar initiated the arrangement, which challenges traditional stereotypes about men driving sexual experimentation, while women reluctantly participate. However, Dino's response, agreeing despite discomfort to preserve the relationship, reflects masculine socialization that discourages men from expressing vulnerability or admitting they feel threatened by female sexual agency. Had Dino felt psychologically safe articulating his genuine feelings, "This makes me profoundly uncomfortable, and I cannot participate without damaging myself psychologically," outcomes might have differed. But masculine identity often includes expectations of sexual confidence, emotional stoicism, and tolerance of situations that privately cause distress. Admitting vulnerability can feel like admitting inadequacy. The aftermath for the Abasolo families deserves consideration. Ramon and Ella's relatives were collateral victims of this tragedy, losing loved ones to violence that emerged from circumstances those families likely knew nothing about. Their grief was compounded by learning intimate details about Ramon and Ella's private activities during the investigation and trial. This forced public disclosure of sexual behavior that would normally remain private added shame and social stigma to their mourning. Community responses to such cases often involve moral judgment rather than empathy. people distance themselves from victims by highlighting choices they disapprove of. Well, if they hadn't been doing that, as though unconventional sexual choices justify violence or mean victims bear responsibility for their own deaths. This victim-blaming pattern appears across various crime types, but intensifies when victims' behavior violates social norms. The case also raises questions about rehabilitation and redemption in criminal justice. Dino served 6 years of a 10-year sentence and was released with good conduct time allowance. This reflects a rehabilitative rather than purely punitive approach to criminal justice. The philosophy that people who demonstrate genuine change deserve opportunities to reintegrate into society. Critics of early release might argue that taking 3 lives warrants longer incarceration, regardless of behavioral improvements. Supporters of rehabilitation counter that indefinite imprisonment serves no purpose if someone no longer poses a threat and can become a functional parent and community member. This tension between punishment and rehabilitation remains central to criminal justice philosophy worldwide. Dino's successful reintegration, maintaining employment, rebuilding relationship with his son, avoiding recidivism, suggests that in his specific case, the rehabilitative approach achieved its intended outcomes. However, this success doesn't minimize the permanent loss experienced by the victims' families or validate the actions that necessitated rehabilitation. As we conclude this examination of the Soriano case, several critical lessons emerge, insights applicable far beyond this specific tragedy. The most fundamental lesson involves the danger of using novelty to address relationship dysfunction. When couples experience disconnection, boredom, or dissatisfaction, the underlying issues typically involve communication breakdowns, unmet emotional needs, divergent life goals, or accumulated resentments. Introducing external complexity, whether through consensual non-monogamy, dramatic lifestyle changes, or other radical interventions, doesn't resolve these foundational problems. It merely adds additional variables to an already unstable equation. Healthy relationships require what therapists call differentiation, the ability to maintain individual identity while remaining emotionally connected to a partner. Marikar's boredom likely reflected insufficient individual fulfillment rather than inherent marital deficiency. Pursuing personal interests, career development, meaningful friendships, or individual therapy might have addressed her dissatisfaction more effectively than seeking external relationship experimentation. For Dino, the critical failure was agreeing to something fundamentally incompatible with his psychological needs. Authentic consent requires not just verbal agreement, but genuine internal alignment. When someone agrees to preserve a relationship while knowing the agreement violates their values or emotional boundaries, they're setting themselves up for profound psychological harm. The lesson here isn't that consensual non-monogamy is inherently problematic. Many people navigate such arrangements successfully. Rather, it's that these structures require exceptional emotional maturity, secure attachment, excellent communication, and genuine mutual desire. When any of these elements is absent, the risk of psychological damage or relationship destruction increases exponentially. This case also illustrates the importance of accessible mental health resources. Had Dino sought professional help when he first experienced distress, after the February encounter or during the weeks of suspicion, a trained therapist might have helped him process emotions, establish boundaries, and make different choices. Instead, he internalized his suffering until it reached crisis levels, then acted from a place of acute psychological disturbance. For the surviving son, Gio, this case represents the collateral damage of adult decisions. Children don't choose their parents' relationship dynamics, yet they bear consequences throughout their lives. Gio lost his mother, his father was imprisoned, his childhood was disrupted, and he'll carry this history into adulthood. His story reminds us that relationship choices affect not just partners, but entire family systems, particularly vulnerable children who have no agency in adult decisions. The Soriano case ultimately serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust, the complexity of human psychology under stress, and the catastrophic potential of seemingly manageable relationship problems. 3 people died. A child was orphaned and traumatized. Multiple families experienced devastating loss. A man destroyed his own life and others. All of this emerged from what began as a couple's attempt to address marital boredom, a common, manageable problem that escalated because they chose experimentation over communication, novelty over therapy, and external solutions over internal growth. The hotel room in Baguio where this tragedy occurred is just a room now, cleaned, rented to other guests, functioning as though nothing happened. But for those connected to this case, April 2016 remains a permanent marker, the moment when relationship dysfunction crossed into irreversible tragedy, when choices made in pursuit of excitement resulted in destruction no one intended. But everyone involved will carry forever.